Good afternoon, Christian, and thank you very much for giving us some of your time to talk to the Mint.
Good afternoon, Henry. Thanks for having me again.
And we were planning to talk about trade. Obviously, this is in the headlines with ongoing potential trade wars that Trump have started around the world. And you've written a proposal for reform of how the trade system works, which is very well timed. And I wonder if we could start with you giving a sort of brief overview of what your proposal is.
It's a pleasure to do so. Well, actually, this proposal comes long before Trump was known in the broader public. And it started with what I call a false dichotomy between free trade, which everybody was in favor of, and the only alternative of protectionism. So public debate only had these two extreme options as alternatives and nothing in between. And that's why it's a false dichotomy. And in between these two extremes, I propose ethical world trade as one of many alternatives. Tapas means there are plenty of alternatives, but maybe one really in the center of these other two, in the meaning that free trade means trade turns into an end in itself. More trade is always better. The more open a country, the better, always, and no matter which consequences that has. And the other extreme is protectionism. I'm a linguist, and protectionism means that protection becomes the goal, which is nonsensical as well, which means we trade ever less until we don't trade at all because we live in a full autarky. Is likewise nonsensical as free trade. In free trade, on the opposite, we would end up with exporting everything we produce and importing everything we consume. Doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And okay, but this is a classical false dichotomy, and the option in between is trade as a means, which means that trade is nothing bad on the one hand, so we don't need to protect for the sake of protection. We should protect for the sake of our noblest and highest goals, but not for protection itself. And trade is also not an objective. It's just a means. And if it serves our noblest goals, from human rights to peace, to democracy, to climate protection, to social cohesion and just distribution, then we go for it and we promote it and we want more of it because it helps us to achieve our goals. As simple as that. And I'm really surprised that this third alternative, which is so sound and so logical, didn't appear in the debate. It didn't appear because free trade was disguised as the good solution, the best solution, the common good bringing solution. But if you take a closer look, it's nonsensical. Just more trade is always better. It's nonsensical. And well, here is the alternative. Trade is a means at the service of our highest and most noblest goals.
I suppose maybe people might say that by free trade, it's the choice to trade is free rather than necessarily an expansion of trade. I mean, if you know, people trade where they see benefits, don't they?
That's not exact, because in a free trade regime, in a free trade order, which is anchored in the World Trade Organization, it becomes international law and it becomes enforceable international law. So once you're committed to these rules, you're obliged to trade more than you eventually might want to deem.
Commitments in international law are to the terms of trade, not the requirement to trade. I mean, you know, that there's an agreed to rules of trade and the level of tariffs, but then it's up to you whether you trade under those terms, isn't it?
Not really, because in the World Trade Organization, the today 166 member, they make agreements which are binding for all. And once you have agreed to these agreements, and very often that has happened with the help of power politics, so actually against the interests, especially of the countries of the global South, they have to be more open than they want to. And
Yeah, no, I accept that they're more open, i.e. the terms of trade are set, but if individuals don't want to export within a country, they're not forced to export, are they? There are rules around how and where they export and how they import, but it's not a sort of, there isn't an agreement to trade 100 cars or 2,000 minibuses or whatever it is there?
True, you're not obliged to export, but you are obliged to import. This is the point. And the World Trade Organization enforces legally the commitment to import, which means to be as open as you have agreed to in the trade agreements in the World Trade Organization. And this can be very harmful for many countries because many times they import products or also services that they could produce on their own. But according to the World Trade Organization rules, they are not allowed to keep those imports out. They have to allow for these imports.
About what's fair competition, don't they? So they can't give a special subsidy to their own production or so forth. That's the thing.
Well, there are 100 reasons why a country would prefer to produce its own products and to protect some of its infant industries or sensitive service sectors. And in the World Trade Organization, all this becomes very difficult because principally you're not allowed to keep foreign trade outside and to treat foreign producers and manufacturers less favorable than domestic producers. This is actually one of the two main rules of the World Trade Organizations, and the only good that is enforceable, legally enforceable, is trade and investment in these other investment protection agreements. But already the answer to the question, what is enforceable in the current trade and investment order, the answer is trade and investment, and both are no goals, both are means. Nothing against trade, nothing against investment, as I said at the beginning. But when we come to the question, what should be enforceable by international law, then I would start with human rights and with peace and with democracy and with environmental and climate protection. But I would not start with a means. I would not protect a means at all by international law. That's the main failure and system error of the World Trade Organization and those investment protection treatment agreements.
So how do you, what is your proposal to change that so that these, what you term noble goals, are the ones that are privileged, if you like, or enforced or whatever?
Yeah, to make them enforceable. Exactly. First, to clarify which are the goals. And actually, we don't have to clarify because it is clarified by the main acquis of international law in the United Nations, that our overarching goals are peace and human rights and democracy and environmental protection and cultural diversity. These are the goals. And I would make the goals enforceable and use trade and investment and also credit, finance, as means. So what we would need is agreements, international agreements, to enforce the goals and not the means. And that's why the World Trade Organization is by definition outplaced and it has been created outside the United Nations in order to invert this logical order of ends and means. And I would end this this failure and this dead end of trade politics, and I would shift back to the United Nations because we would need just one center of creation and development of international law with one set of goals, and I would put trade and investment at the service of these goals and create different agreements which make these goals enforceable. And now comes the question, how can you make these agreements enforceable? Well, committing member countries to not only ratify all the agreements that already, this is the good news, all these agreements already exist. The human rights agreements exist, the UN Charter, which protects peace, exists, the international labor standards and multilateral environmental agreements, they exist, but they're not hard international law in the meaning that they are enforceable by international tribunals. So two things have to be done. first to create tribunals, same as the World Trade Organization tribunal that also had to be created in 1994 and 1995. And we need the same for climate protection and for the rest of, and for labor standards and for human rights first and foremost. So one of the institutions that should be established and the loophole that should be closed in international law is a World Court of Human Rights. That can be invoked by individuals whose human rights have been violated by transnational corporations. So that has to become enforceable, and countries that do not submit to these new agreements, I call it a United Nations ethical trade zone, with a couple of new regulatory bodies and institutions, and countries that do not submit to these new institutions and to these new agreements, or do not comply with the existing agreements, because ratifying is not enough. You also have to comply, and this means submitting to the tribunals. They would suffer disadvantages in relation to other countries that do comply with these agreements and also submit themselves to the jurisdiction of the new tribunals.
What, from my memory of international law when I studied it, which was some time ago, but what I seem to recall was that these international agreements, which you talk about on the whole range of topics, do actually tend to include, if they do include, their means for enforcement, etc., in the agreements. But generally, countries are unwilling to agree to such, any sorts of enforcement or even monitoring or whatever. And that's why actually trade is unusual, isn't it? Because there isn't, that people have agreed to enforcement and penalties and so forth. Mm. Why do you think now suddenly countries would be willing to agree to such enforcement mechanisms if generally they haven't done in the past?
Two answers. First, it would not be the first attempt to establish a coherent trade order aligned with the goals and objectives of the international community of states within the United Nations family and system. It will be the third attempt. So there are two precedents and predecessors. One in 1944 at the Conference of Bretton Woods, when the Bretton Woods twins were created and established, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Actually, these institutions should have become triplets. But the third institution that was planned, the ITO, International Trade Organization, was stillborn because in the last moment, the US Congress opted against that third organization, and only the twins were born. In a second attempt, there was a better success because in 1964, UNCTAD was born. It's the United Nations Conference for Trade and Development. And as the name says, trade is only considered a means for sustainable development. There we go. This is exactly my my message and my proposal. But UNCTAD did not get any regulatory power. It's more or less a nice institution doing statistics, which is helpful, which is valuable. But the regulatory power lies outside the United Nations, lies at the World Trade Organization, and then those plurilateral and bilateral free trade and investment agreements. But the idea was to endow UNCTAD with regulatory power. Whose idea was it? Now comes a very important point. It was the idea of the Global South, because those who initiated UNCTAD was the group of the 77, then 77 member countries of low and middle income countries. Today, this group comprises 130 members. So if today the G77 was supported by the European Union, just for instance, why not UK as well, to make a third attempt to create a trade order within the United Nations at the service of the international community's goals, then maybe we would have 130 plus 27 or 8, 157 to 158 members from the beginning. But of course, there has to be a last something to be offered to the Global South. That would be a second condition for that.
But it seems to me that the tendency for international agreements in trade and more generally has gone sort of backwards, hasn't it? Because I mean, the WTO has not really achieved any major agreements on trade in the recent past, and also there's been a shift to bilateral agreements, haven't they, or regional trade agreements, which have grown. So you could argue that we're well past the zenith of the time when there was any willingness internationally to agree to common international legal regimes.
Mm. I agree. You could argue that both the World Trade Organization is on a kind of stalemate because no meaningful agreement has been achieved since its foundation, actually.
Yeah, well, GATT, I was thinking, yes, it's the rounds have failed. Well, the Doha round, isn't it, that is still open nominally.
So Doha round has tiny results, but
Yeah.
actually it's a failure. And you're wrong. You're right. We should mention GATT. So World Trade Organization was the successful finishing of the GATT rounds, General Agreement on Tariffs on Trade, and which were concluded with the Uruguay round in 1994, and then in 1995. World Trade Organization started as a successor of the GATT. But since this date, since its foundation, which was the most important success of multilateral free trade agreements, there was no major achievement on the way. And as you said, it was kind of bypassed by both plurilateral, regional, and most importantly, bilateral, both trade agreement and investment protection agreement. But why? The question is why? Because on the multilateral level, the Global South members, they became ever more reluctant against the agendas that were developed by the Quads, what we call Quads, so United States, Canada, European Union, and Japan, the most powerful trade nations, which in their history, this has to be mentioned, in our own history, we were protectors. I would not call this protectionist, but protectors of our young industry. Germany, same as Japan, and United States, same as Great Britain. Just Great Britain first, and then United States, and then Germany. But all did the same. They protected their industry. The industries became strong and powerful, and then they entered into trade relations. And the same should hold true for countries that have an income that is equivalent to the United Nations income or Germany of the late 19th century or early 20th century. So that is the reason why the World Trade Organization did not achieve any major agreement since its beginning. Whereas the United Nations, they do advance. There has been the Paris Agreement in 2015. There have been pronounced the Sustainable Development Goals. There has been established the International Criminal Court in Denmark. So there, although not every country is participating, but this holds true for most of the United Nations agreements. And in the long run, countries join. The most important achievements of United Nations next to the UN Charter itself, the Civil Covenant and the Social Covenant, they started with only 35 ratifiers. That's a very small group of beginners. And today we have more than 180 ratifiers of both human rights covenants. But United States haven't signed the Social Covenant, and China hasn't ratified the Civil Covenant. So still not everybody is in. And still, the United Nations is evolving. And in my perspective, it's just a question of time when even the veto powers in the Security Council of the United Nations will fade out. It's a matter of time only. And maybe governments, that's the last part of my answer to your extremely important key question. If countries are so reluctant to further develop international law on the multilateral level, which is true, but the third part of my answer is it's going slow with governments, but it would go faster if you ask the citizens. Because if you ask the citizens in those more or less democratic countries, if they prefer a trade order that is in alignment with peace and democracy and human rights and climate protection, or if they prefer a trade order that does not even refer to non-trade concerns like peace and democracy and human rights, then I'm totally convinced, and I did some experimental votings on that question, that in any country, majority of the citizens would prefer a trade order within the United Nations system and aligned with those other prominent goals of the international community of states.
We just go back to that point about whether the things are going in the right direction in terms of more, increasing collaboration internationally. Trump seems to, well, I suppose increasing tensions between US and China. It's not just Trump, is it? I mean, back 5 years ago, China was seen as a major partner in global trade, but over the last 5 or so years, US direction on that has changed dramatically, and China to some extent as well, and obviously Russia being involved in a war, and so on. So there seems that over the last few years, in very short period, things have really got hugely worse in terms of the potential for international collaboration, haven't they? So that the broader, if there was a trend towards collaboration, it's currently reversing.
I would intuitively agree that the reluctance against new international agreement is growing, and it is becoming over the past years more difficult to conclude new agreements. Although there are exceptions, I already mentioned some of them, and the pandemic treaty is another exception. Although United States and Argentina do not join this agreement, but still it's a new agreement. And this doesn't mean that I'm fully supporting the content of the agreement. I would prefer the World Health Organization to be a fully public institution without private financiers, but it's a different story. And coming back to the trade problem between the United States and China, I think we, before measuring our sympathy or antipathy for or against Trump, we should look at the current account balance sheet of the United States. And here we find the fact that the last surplus was in 1991. And over the past years, the deficit of the current account balance of the United States hit a new historical record of $1 trillion. So this is a huge, huge, huge problem. For any other country, it would be a deadly problem in the terms of sovereign default. The United States is the only country in the world for which is not an immediate deadly problem. But still, the first question that we have to pose is, what is the solution offered by the World Trade Organization today? And the answer is there's no solution offered at all, because this problem doesn't exist in the ideology of the World Trade Organization, because it bears this neoclassical trade theory that says that current accounts balances come into equilibrium by themselves, either by the adjustment of exchange rates, and if exchange rates don't adjust, then the adjustment will happen by loans and salaries.
Yes, and isn't it? I mean, obviously, what is exceptional about the US is the dollar, and the people, want those dollars. The world runs on dollars. So while the dollar is the global currency, that requires the US to be in deficit to supply the dollars to run the world financial system.
And still, it's a problem to be in debt. First, I agree that the United States have the monetary hegemon, and everybody needs dollars in order to buy commodities on the one hand, and also the dollar is the world's reserve currency. But this is no law. There is no agreement for that.
No,
The
no,
Brit
no. It's happened by the dynamics, hasn't it?
and
But
that could change. And that could
it change?
change.
How will it change? Because again, I suppose for people to, if you go back to Keynes and trying to create some sort of multilateral currency of some sort, that would require, again, a lot of people to agree to do that in a
Yeah.
context of conflict, disagreement, etc., etc.
Did we never see progress in history?
No,
It's
but it
exactly.
just means that I suppose that history at the moment has got a bit hotter. So in the global north anyway.
It's ambivalent, yeah. Especially because it's getting hotter and because we're getting deeper into the poly crisis, and maybe a new window of opportunity might pop up to revisit Keynes' proposal. And I think Keynes' proposal from 1944, I will explain it in a minute for those who don't know it, the Bancor Plan, a proposal for monetary collaboration on a global level, is a lucid proposal, which has never been more current than in these days, looking at the tremendous trade imbalances that we're witnessing. And it was made exactly for that. It was made as a prevention mechanism against trade wars and consequent in the ultimate instance against political wars. Because in history, looking back at history, political wars and geopolitical wars was often the consequence of trade wars. And Keynes, with his proposal, wanted to prevent both with a very intriguing solution. He wanted to bring back trade imbalances into equilibrium, both surpluses and deficits, with a series of sanctions in order to prevent these imbalances and trade wars and geopolitical wars. And I think that's lucid, and it should have been implemented. And the only reason why it was not implemented at the Bretton Woods conference in 1944 was that the United States had such a high self-esteem that they could just decline the proposals and say, we will be the hegemon from now on, and they still are. But no hegemon in history has ever lasted forever. So the moment will come when there will be no longer a hegemon called United States of America. And then United States of America will benefit from Keynes' proposal, because then they will not all of a sudden jump from being the world's leading currency to have a tremendous twin deficit, a trade deficit, and a budget deficit, which will be a deadly problem for them from that moment. But they will be brought back into equilibrium, and China as well, and Germany as well, and Great Britain as well. Everybody will be brought back to equilibrium thanks to the proposal of monetary adjustment of John Maynard Keynes.
No, I mean, I think, yeah, it made a lot of sense. I suppose the problem is that, well, it is the US who currently obviously have the dominant currency. And I think in a way they have a love-hate relationship with it, don't they? In that they can't do without it because it's the basis of them being able to run a huge deficit and meet their needs from imports. But it's also a problem in terms of it's ripped the guts out of its productive capacity, potentially made it vulnerable in terms of wars because it just doesn't have the manufacturing capacity for armaments and so on. But how are you going to who would be able to persuade the American population to give up the dollar's international role?
Mm. Maybe that's not the first step. The first step to make a new vision popular, and actually my vision of ethical world trade is not that new as it looks like, because it builds on previous visions, like that contribution of John Maynard Keynes on monetary international collaboration and balanced trade. So the first step is to circulate this new vision, because until recently, any journalist only knew the false dichotomy of either free trade or protectionism. So the first step is to inform journalists and opinion leaders that there is at least one reasonable third alternative, which is ethical world trade within the United Nations, with balanced trade, which is an advantage for many countries, both surplus and deficit countries, in which trade is just a means, which is at the services of our goals. So this trade-off between trade and climate protection, for instance, or human rights on the other side, would end finally. So there are many advantages, and I just mentioned it briefly, but there would be more advantages for the global South in at least my proposal, because they would be allowed to have a certain current account surplus in order to catch up with the richer countries. And they could use intellectual property for free until the per capita income reaches a certain level. And instead of letting in multi-utility corporations from the global north, which privatize water supply, for instance, and electricity supply, there would be an agreement between public services agencies from the countries in which they perform the best to the countries which are most in need for these services. So this would be already some of the advantages that I include in my proposal for the Global South. And I think the most important comes now. We are going full circle. If trade and investment are no longer enforceable, all countries, all members of the UNETs, of the United Nations Ethical Trade Zone, but especially beneficial for Global South members would be, they can be as open or as protected as they want to be. Actually, that would be free or voluntary trade. If they want to protect a specific sector, they can do it. The only condition is that they have balanced trade. So they cannot close a sector in order to become a mercantilist protectionist country, because if they close one sector, they have to open up another one. But they become flexible, and they also decide the degree of openness. If they want to be moderately open, or on a medium level, or quite open, it's their choice, and their capacity to make their domestic policies from technology policy to environmental policy to industry policy, all that becomes completely free again. Actually, that's the line of Hayon Chang, the South Korean rebel economist who wrote the book Putting Back the Ladder. So I'm also including his view and his proposal to make the whole package of ethical world trade much more attractive for the countries of the Global South.
And are there some steps? Is this a sort of has to be a big bang, everything has to be fixed at once, everyone has to sign up, or is the ways, more enlightened countries could lead on and start building maybe, and other such, that might support your proposal?
Yeah, well, as for the strategy on implementation, I have three approaches that have occurred to me, and I also have two co-authors with the current study on this proposal. And the first one is to spread the new idea via opinion leaders and science. It's a peer-reviewed scientific publication. That's one strategic approach. The second one is to focus in the European Union, because I'm a citizen of the European Union, to focus on Article 206 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, because this is regulating external trade. And it says now, I use now my own words, but it says the meaning is trade is an end in and of itself. More trade, we want to have more trade as much as we can, and all barriers to trade should be eliminated. And I would change this, and I make a very precise proposal. Instead of this, trade should be considered a means to serve not only the goals of the United Nations, from peace to human rights to climate protection, but these goals are the same goals of the European Union. So my point is that the current Article 206 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union is not even at the service and in alignment and coherence with the values and objectives of the European Union's external action. It's in contradiction to them. And so there could be a European citizens initiative to change the wording of Article 206 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union. And the third approach is to increase democracy, because I'm not only working on trade, I'm working on democratizing the economy and on a higher degree of democracy than what we have experienced so far within our best liberal democracies. I call this a common good democracy, and in a common good democracy, people would have the power to initiate a voting on which trade order their government has to support. And then they could mandate their government to focus on free trade and to enforce free trade agreements. That's one option. But they also could mandate their government to go for an ethical trade order within the United Nations in their diplomatic and international trade relations policy. And this is a new form of democracy which we haven't known so far, but at least it's a strategic options how in the future innovations within better democracies could work. And the motivation for this is that I know by experience that the ordinary citizens, if we ask them, they would already today prefer a trade order which is within the United Nations and aligned with our goal, rather than being in contradiction to them.
And do you think the current trade war, and actually which is somewhat hotter between the EU and the US than the UK and the US, but is that going to be helpful or hinder? Is it creating more of a discussion in the EU, do you find, about what the aims should be, or is it just shutting it down and everyone's got to go to war?
Well, I'm observing in the rhetoric, but also in the legal initiatives in the European Union that in the treaty of the European Union, we have these wonderful goals from peace to democracy, same as the United Nations, and solidarity, not competition, solidarity, and justice, not increasing inequality, but justice. And then the real trade policy is in total contradiction to these goals and values of the external action of the European Union. So it was a super egoistic.
Well, I take that point. I suppose the question is, at this particular point in time, where the EU is probably everyone's talking to each other about how they respond to the US and its tariffs, etc., does that help your case, or is there any space left to discuss these bigger issues beyond a discussion of whether the EU should raise its tariffs and to what extent?
Yeah, I was going there. So as eye by eye policy, now if US is going to raise tariffs, we are going to for revenge and so on. This will lead into a downward spiral, and this increases the probability, although quite low still at the moment, that the European Union acknowledges and recognizes that they haven't offered any solution to the United States. So the United States has a current account deficit of 3.5% of their GDP, and European Union has a surplus of 3.5% of our GDP. This doesn't match, and the European Union hasn't been credible over the past years, not offering any solution to the United States. And they are still fighting, and they're still accepting this trade war. But at the same time, I hope that they start to think over new, innovative, groundbreaking, disruptive solutions. And this idea of an ethical world trade is actually not a disruption, but it's a correction of going back to our own values and objectives, which are the same values and objectives of the United Nations. And at the same time, it would include a solution to the United States problem. And then Trump would not have to react with erratic tariffs, which are just creating confusion and chaos, and which I don't support at all. But I understand the motive behind, and the motive behind is the historic deficit in the current account. And if the European Union starts acknowledging this motive for the problem of the United States, then this might lead, maybe not between Trump and the current administration, but maybe in the midterm, it might lead to a new solution on the horizon. And at least with this weak hope that this might happen, I'm submitting my proposal, and we are submitting our offer with this vision. And we know for every vision there comes the moment when it's seen and sometimes even implemented. And John Maynard Keynes is still waiting for his vision to be implemented, but then all of a sudden it happens. And why not in this joint power with and enveloped in this idea of an ethical trade order in the United Nations.
Brilliant. Well, yes, I think it's going to be, if not now, when, I suppose, as they say. And I will attach your proposal so people can read it, and we'll watch with great interest to see if the EU conversation does move on and what comes out of that.
Well, let's hope the best, and thanks a lot for this beautiful conversation.
Thank you, Christian. That's brilliant.